The truth for Cassandra was that she always believed a marriage should be a cathedral, a holy space built on shared intimacy, nurtured not just by affection, but by daily acts of recognition and mutual presence. Lately, her 8-year union had begun to resemble a beautifully constructed, yet uninhabited structure. Julian, her husband, was not inherently cruel or dismissive in a way that warranted an open argument, but the demands of his career had become a consuming force. Even when physically present, his attention was perpetually fragmented emails, conference calls, the incessant chime of his phone serving as a constant barrier. Their exchanges were reduced to logistical checklists. Did you handle the utility? Payment? What's the plan for tomorrow's dinner? The dry cleaning needs collecting. Cassandra didn't crave dramatic declarations. She simply missed the spontaneous gestures, the brief grounding touch on her shoulder, an authentic compliment, a shared, playful secret. She often caught herself applying a fresh layer of lip stain or carefully smoothing her dress before Julian returned, only to realize he rarely lifted his eyes to see her. The body she inhabited, once a canvas for their shared tenderness, now felt like a secluded chamber that received no visitors. On a bleak Tuesday afternoon, following a morning characterized by Julian's familiar echoing silence, Cassandra made an impulsive decision. She booked a deep tissue therapy session. It felt like a simple, justifiable act of self-care. A friend had recommended a quiet wellness center across town, promising a highly skilled practitioner and an atmosphere conducive to profound relaxation. It will dissolve your strain, her friend had assured her. The center was discreetly housed within a renovated brownstone, its entrance unassuming but welcoming. Inside, soft, ambient music floated through the air, interwoven with the comforting, earthy scents of cedarwood and bergamot. A gracious attendant greeted her, presented a form, and directed her to a low-lit waiting area furnished with velvety armchairs. Cassandra felt the first stirrings of calm long before the session was scheduled to begin. A few minutes later, he materialized. Miss Hawthorne, the voice was a measured, resonant baritone. She looked up to see Silas, her assigned therapist. He was strikingly tall, with a confident posture and a broad-shouldered physique that registered a brief, unexpected spike in her pulse. He offered a courteous, practiced smile that was professional yet subtly commanding. "Yes, that's me," Cassandra managed to reply, feeling suddenly and acutely aware of her own movement as she rose to follow him. The therapy suite was swathed in shadow, illuminated by a solitary lamp that cast a warm bronze radiance over the walls. In the center, a treatment table stood neatly prepared, draped in immaculate ivory linen. A collection of essential oils, their aromas rich and evocative, were lined up on a nearby shelf. Silas motioned for her to place her belongings. Aside, "I will step out momentarily while you settle onto the table," he stated. "Please lie face down beneath the covering, and we can commence." His delivery was entirely straightforward, utterly routine. Yet Cassandra's hands trembled faintly as she disrobed. She reasoned that it was merely the awkwardness of vulnerability. Before a stranger, she climbed onto the table, drew the linen sheet over herself, and consciously attempted to govern her breathing. When Silas returned, his movements were deliberate and efficient. He adjusted the table height, warmed the oil in his palms, and initiated the treatment at her shoulders. The initial firm pressure of his hands elicited a deep, involuntary sigh of relief from Cassandra. His touch was penetrating and focused, skillfully working through knots of tension she hadn't realized she was harboring. "Is the pressure adequate?" he inquired. "Perfect," she whispered, her voice unexpectedly hushed initially. She concentrated solely on the physical feedback, the meticulous way his thumbs addressed the deep muscle adhesions, the smooth track of his palms down her back. But soon, the experience subtly shifted. His hands moved with a cadence that felt almost like a private conversation, lingering perhaps a heartbeat longer than strictly necessary. A warmth began to radiate beneath her skin, a heat fueled not just by the therapeutic oil, but by the awareness that this man, was touching areas her husband had not in weeks. Cassandra's thoughts oscillated wildly between logical explanation and sheer sensation. It's simply therapy. This is standard procedure. He's executing his profession. Yet her body disregarded the mental narrative. Each pass seemed to awaken a long dormant part of her spirit. She realized she was pressing her lips together, stifling the primal urge to arch or shift under his attention. The tranquil music continued, yet the sound she registered most acutely was the rhythmic, close proximity of his breathing, perfectly synchronized with the movement of his hands. When his fingertips brushed the skin at the lower curve of her rib cage, just beneath the edge of the sheet, her chest constricted. She willed herself to remain motionless, to dismiss the overthinking, that the internal truth was irrefutable. She did not want this session to conclude. As Silas inclined his body slightly to reposition her arm, Cassandra glimpsed his reflection in the small, wall-mounted mirror. For a fraction of a second, their eyes connected. It was not accidental. He held her gaze just long enough to ignite a flare of recklessness within her before smoothly looking away, as though the exchange had never occurred. Her heart began to beat a rapid tattoo against the table. This moment was supposed to be procedural, entirely unremarkable. Yet Cassandra already felt she had crossed an invisible boundary, defined not by physical action, but by burgeoning desire. And though she couldn't articulate the reason, a part of her silently hoped his hands would continue to explore. Cassandra attempted to regulate her respiration as Silas's hands traced down her spine once more. She desperately wanted to convince herself that she was fabricating the intensity, that his touch was indistinguishable from any other professional massage she might have received. But the undeniable reality pressed against her nerves with every fluid motion. This had transcended mere muscle manipulation. This was something altogether different. His palms pressed into her lower back, holding with a penetrating heat that flowed through her core. When his fingers skimmed the perimeter of the sheet at her hips, Cassandra inhaled sharply, a slight gasp escaping her. He did not overtly breach the line, not fully, not yet, but the intense proximity was enough to trigger a surge of adrenaline. She thought of Julian, of their predictable evening ritual, and his distant eyes glued to his device. Suddenly, the initial flicker of guilt morphed into a fierce, simmering defiance. "Are you entirely comfortable?" Silas asked, his voice subdued. "Yes," she whispered, the assent almost too instantaneous. He shifted position, pouring more oil into his hands. The soft, slick sound of the liquid hitting his skin made Cassandra shiver. When he began to spread the oil across her upper thighs, starting from the outside and gradually moving inward, her body betrayed her with a faint, involuntary tremor. She felt the urge to intervene, to remind him of professional limits, yet she remained utterly still. A dormant part of her, a desire she hadn't recognized in years, was ravenous for this. Attention. The strokes became slower, distinctly more intentional. Each descending pass brought his hands closer to the tender inner region of her legs, halting just shy of any explicit intimacy. It was a deliberate, tantalizing restraint, and she felt her breathing become shallow. Her intellect screamed a warning, but her body subtly arched toward his touch, offering silent, subconscious consent. Cassandra briefly opened her eyes, catching another glimpse of the mirror angled toward the ceiling. Silas's face was composed, impassive, but his eyes met hers for an electric second. The air between them grew heavy, palpable. In that instant, all that remained unsaid became profoundly understood. Her thoughts fractured. This is forbiddance. "I am a married woman. I must object." But the words dissolved before she could speak them. Instead, her heart pounded with a nervous, urgent anticipation, waiting to discover precisely how far he intended to proceed. When Silas leaned forward to adjust the linen sheet along her back, she felt it firm, unmistakable pressure against her hip for the briefest, most searing instant. Her eyes widened and a wave of heat surged through her chest. There was no room for doubt now. Cassandra froze, suspended between startled shock and a sudden acute hunger. She expected him to recoil instantly, to apologize profusely, to dismiss it as an accidental brush, but he did not. He lingered just long enough for her to recognize the absolute intentionality of the act, and still, she offered no protest. Her silence functioned as an implicit sanction. Silas's hands resumed their gradual journey, but they now possessed a different energy, more intimate, more audacious. His fingertips grazed the sides of her ribs, then deliberately slipped beneath the sheet's border, as if testing the extent of her willingness. Cassandra closed her eyes, her pulse hammering against her eardrums. She could have decisively halted the process there. She could have instantly pulled the sheet tighter across her body. Yet instead, she let out a soft, heavy exhalation, allowing the covering to descend marginally lower. That single sound was all the encouragement he required. The movements transformed, from standard strokes into sensual caresses. The targeting of muscles blurred into something far more explicit. Cassandra's skin prickled and warmed under every sweeping pass of his hands. The room, which had been a haven of calm music and therapeutic scents, now throbbed with unacknowledged tension. "Just let go," Silas murmured, his voice now deep and resonant, almost a command. She yielded instantly, her body softening beneath him. The underlying guilt persisted, a subtle throb beneath the surface, but it was being swiftly overwhelmed by the rising tide of sensation. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she felt profoundly desired, truly seen, touched with unmistakable intention. When he lowered his head again, his breath ghosted over her ear, and the proximity sent shivers down her neck. He breathed something low, an unintelligible sound, but the tone alone was electrifying. She angled her head slightly, catching his reflection in the mirror one last time. His eyes held the exact consuming hunger that was blossoming within her dot. It was no longer just a therapeutic massage. Cassandra's consciousness fragmented between a mounting dread of the repercussions and the intoxicating rush of the present. Every nerve ending in her body screamed for more. The precise line separating professional conduct from raw desire had already become indistinct, and now it was certain to vanish entirely. Her fingers clenched the edge of the table as his hand descended, pressing into her thighs again, this time with absolute conviction. His touch was firmer, unmistakably, bolder, and she tilted her pelvis a fraction of an inch, an undeniable expression of her craving. A small, involuntary sound escaped her lips before she could suppress it, a sound Silas could not possibly misunderstand. He paused just long enough for their eyes to lock again in the mirror's reflection. Then, without exchanging a single word, his hand slipped further beneath the sheet, systematically dissolving their final remaining barrier. Cassandra's breath hitched in her throat, her body trembling at the shock and intensity of the sensation she had both feared and secretly welcomed. In that irrevocable moment, she understood there was no possible return. What had begun as a quest for relief had escalated to temptation, and temptation had now culminated in absolute surrender. The instant Silas's hand breached the boundary of the sheet, Cassandra's entire system jolted with a primal rush she hadn't experienced in years. It was as if every isolated nerve ending in her skin had simultaneously ignited. She froze for a suspended second, waiting for the piercing shriek of her conscience to overpower the sensation. but all she perceived was the sound of her own accelerated breathing and the steady, sure motion of Silas's hands moving with purpose. The name of her husband, Julian, flickered distantly in her mind, like a faint signal from a remote chamber she had no intention of entering. In this place, in this moment, there was only the potent, building heat inside her. Silas's movements were methodical, his touch unhurried yet entirely confident. The air in the small space felt dense, saturated with the dual scent of oil and something more elemental, a desire too thick to ignore. The muted pulse of the background music transformed into an unconscious rhythm to which their bodies subtly aligned. Cassandra gripped the perimeter of the table, torn between a sudden surge of guilt and the undeniable pull of release. But when Silas leaned fully over her, his chest brushing lightly against her back, the decision was unequivocally made. She did not resist him. She arched subtly toward him. The sheet slipped further, peeling away from her waist, and suddenly there was nothing left to conceal. Silas's hands now moved across her skin without impediment, and Cassandra released a soft, unedited gasp. The sound seemed only to embolden him. He pressed his body close to hers, a hard, undeniable presence, and she finally permitted herself to accept the truth she had sensed earlier. This was not a figment of her imagination. For a single heartbeat, she considered uttering his name, asserting that the limit had been surpassed. But the truth was, she actively did not want it to cease. She craved this. She needed it. Silas gently guided her, turning her beneath him, his gaze locking with hers in the mirror's frame one last time. No verbal exchanges were necessary. Every single thing was communicated in the shared silence, the palpable hunger, the reckless abandon, the mutual, unspoken permission. When their bodies finally merged, the action was not tentative or soft, but driven by urgency, as if both had endured an unbearable, protracted wait. Cassandra clung to him, her fingers digging into his back, the accumulated years of emotional starvation and solitude pouring out of her in uncontrolled waves. Every unified movement was simultaneously an agonizing betrayal and a stunning liberation, an act of self-punishment and a desperate reward. Time seemed to fracture and blur. The appointment that had commenced with therapeutic oils and precise manipulation now burned with a raw, fierce intensity. Cassandra's gasps grew louder, her body surrendering completely to the sensation. Silas moved with a focused blend of physical strength and innate control, never hesitating, never uncertain. He possessed a clear mastery over the moment, and Cassandra, for the first time in an age, stopped the process of thought entirely. When the climax overwhelmed her, it was like the sudden, explosive shattering of restrictive chains she hadn't realized were binding her. She bit hard on her lip, stifling. The sound, yet the profound tremors that ran through her body confessed everything. Silas held her securely through the entire episode, a steady anchor as the waves of release coursed through her system. Then, as swiftly as it had erupted, the charged silence returned. Cassandra lay perfectly still, her chest rising and falling, with heavy spent breaths. The mingled scent of sandalwood, sweat, and oil hung heavy in the air. She felt the oil's damp residue on her skin, the fading warmth of Silas's touch, and the cool breath of the circulating air on her exposed body. The hard, cold weight of reality abruptly returned. She quickly pulled the linen sheet high, clutching it defensively to her chest as if it could somehow shield her from the undeniable fact of her actions. Silas stepped back, his expression astonishingly composed, almost returning to professional neutrality, as if he had not just violated the most profound of boundaries with her. He dried his hands with a clean towel, his movements measured, entirely self-possessed. Cassandra slowly pushed herself upright, her legs unsteady, not from exhaustion, but from the brutal storm of conflicting emotions churning within her, raw pleasure, searing guilt and paralyzing fear. She avoided looking at him directly, fixing her gaze instead on the polished floor, attempting desperately to collect her scattered self. "Please take all the time you need," Silas said softly. His voice was once again even purely professional. She managed a weak nod. The words were hopelessly trapped in her throat. As she dressed, her mind was a whirlwind of agonizing questions. What catastrophic mistake have I made? How did I permit this to happen? Is there any possibility Julian will discover this? And yet, beneath the surging panic, another voice, softer, but stubbornly persistent, whispered, "I feel vibrantly, dangerously alive again." When she eventually emerged from the therapy suite, Silas held the door open for her, his professional demeanor perfectly intact. To any outside observer, it would have appeared that an entirely mundane service had been concluded. He offered a courteous nod, and she mirrored it, her hands trembling subtly as she gripped her purse. The receptionist smiled with genuine warmth. "We sincerely hope you found your session relaxing, Miss Hawthorne. Would you care to pre-book your next appointment?" Cassandra hesitated, her throat suddenly dry. She knew she should have refused, should have sprinted out the door, swearing a silent vow never to return to this place. Instead, she forced a small, brittle smile and replied, "I will reach out." "To you later this week?" The cool evening air struck her face, and she inhaled sharply. Her heart continued to race, and her skin retained an insistent phantom tingling. She moved quickly toward her vehicle, her mind a turbulent avalanche of conflicting sentiments. As she settled into the driver's seat, clutching the steering wheel with white knuckles, a single dominant thought echoed. This changes the fundamental reality of everything. Would she confess the truth to Julian? Would she attempt to bury the entire event in a deep vault of secrecy? Or would she eventually find herself drawn back to that dimly lit room, intensely craving the hands of the man who had resurrected a part of her she hadn't realized was starving? Cassandra had no definitive answer. All she knew with absolute certainty was that the marriage she had departed that morning was not the same marriage she was now returning to. And deep in the core of her being, a part of her was disturbingly unsure if she wanted it to be.